Disney is facing heavy criticism over its new film Mulan. After it emerged they filmed in Xinjiang and thanked a government branch involved in Uyghur concentration camps. I'll be going in depth into this. Also, the technology at the heart of Bitcoin is now being used by the CCP for its abusive social control programs. And we'll also be speaking with Rubacek, author of Who Are China's Walking Dead, about her interviews with former CCP officials and why they call themselves the Walking Dead. So stay tuned for that. Hey, welcome back everyone. First off, some breaking news. Disney is facing heavy criticism and the phrase Boycott Mulan has been trending on Twitter after it emerged they filmed part of that movie in Xinjiang. This also comes after it was found that Disney thanked several CCP branches involved in the persecution of Muslim Uyghurs, and that was in the credits of the live-action film Mulan. This includes a thank you they wrote to the Turpan Public Security Bureau in Xinjiang. Now keep in mind, the Turpan Municipality Public Security Bureau was recently included on the U.S. Export Administration Regulation Entity List for its involvement in human rights abuses in China, including directly for its involvement of the Chinese Communist Party's concentration camps and its high-tech surveillance systems, again, thanked directly by Disney. And calls to boycott Mulan have now extended to boycott Disney overall. National View writer Alexandra De Sanctis noted on Twitter that Disney had previously said it may have a difficult time filming in Georgia in the United States over the state passing the pro-life heartbeat bill, and pointed out the hypocrisy of Disney filming in Xinjiang and thanking the CCP's branch, again directly involved in Muslim prison and re-education camps. This follows news that Chinese Communist Party authorities in Xinjiang also have been forcefully sterilizing women who are ethnic Uyghurs, forcing them to have abortions, and even committing infanticide. Again, ethnic genocide, basically, is what we're seeing there. Now, a bit more on this. Remember what I said previously. We're going to see, very likely, ongoing backlash against Western companies that have gotten themselves tied up with the Chinese Communist Party as the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses are exposed. Disney is the latest victim of this. Disney is being exposed, again, for a few different things. On one side, because in the U.S., they like to virtue signal. They like to play up and get behind social movements because it's good for business, it's good for marketing. But again, they're doing things on one side. They're criticizing things in the United States while openly thanking the CCP branches involved in things 100 times worse in China. And so again, this hypocrisy is being exposed. And companies that have been virtue signaling, companies like Nike and Adidas and so on, companies in the United States that have this whole brand around opposing slavery and so on, they've been exposed to some extent of being involved in Xinjiang, where again you have actual slave labor taking place. And many of these companies are now being called out for either direct involvement in that or for being involved in things around it. Again, also as this gets exposed, as the Chinese Communist Party's different human rights abuses are exposed, many different companies in the West are going to be exposed right alongside them. And also we can look at the trends of what is now taking place and the trajectory of those trends. Based on that trajectory, we can see where things are heading. What's the trajectory right now? Well, here's what's happening. The trend is that the Chinese Communist Party's abusive programs across the board are now being exposed. When it comes to the CCP launching internal purges, when it comes to businesses in China being exposed, for example, for manipulating numbers of their companies on the U.S. stock exchange, when it comes to different companies being exposed for being involved in human rights abuses, slave labor, ethnic genocide, you name it. Again, the focus lately has been on Xinjiang. But across China, they have programs like this, whether it's persecution of Tibetans, persecution of people in Inner Mongolia, persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, house Christians. Again, the Chinese Communist Party's abuses, the list of these is very long. And even its abuses of the regular Chinese people, especially right now when the country is facing massive problems with natural disasters and also the fallout of the new coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. Different companies have been involved in this based on this trajectory of these things being exposed across the board as these Chinese companies are exposed, as these corrupt practices in China are exposed, as the CCP's abuses are exposed. we're very likely to see U.S. companies and other Western companies having been involved directly with the branches on these programs, being involved directly in the programs, or having involvement alongside them. This is where the trajectory is heading. Also in other news, the new coronavirus epidemic in China is still not over, even by the CCP's own admission, with its ongoing lockdowns and strict social control measures. Yet despite this, the Chinese Communist Party recently held a, quote, anti-epidemic commendation conference that was on September 8th, and they gave awards, medals, to 4 different people, including respiratory doctor Zhang Nanshan and CCP military Major General Chen Wei. This awards ceremony was met by criticism from Chinese citizens, however, who believe that Zhang Nanshan, a Chinese pulmonologist and top medical advisor, failed to warn the public about the Chinese Communist Party virus threat. And they're accusing him as well of taking advantage of the pandemic and taking it as an opportunity to sell ineffective supplements. Now, what's the bigger picture here? This is a stereotypical communist move to run propaganda events congratulating party figures while the people continue to suffer. The Chinese Communist Party, again, has ongoing lockdowns, ongoing social control systems to deal with this virus. People locked in their homes. In Xinjiang, for example, people being forced to take medications, but they don't even know what they are. And videotaping themselves taking the medications. Being forced to go to locations where Communist Party officials can monitor them while they do this. People who violate the lockdown measures are being handcuffed outside their homes and publicly shamed. In different parts of China as well, where they have these lockdowns, there have been reports, for example, of people having no time to prepare ahead of time and having shortages of food and basic supplies. Chinese Communist Party officials in some of these areas have even bolted people's homes shut. People are locked inside their homes, sometimes with metal bars. They are not allowed to leave. The Chinese people are facing these abuses, going through this, while the Communist Party itself is congratulating itself for its success in dealing with the virus. And also inside China, the Chinese Communist Party is deepening its controls over public discourse. Over the course of about a month, its internet authorities have closed close to 74,000 live broadcast rooms and deleted the online accounts of more than 100,000 streamers. The Chinese Communist Party's Cyberspace Administration recently held a, quote, special rectification meeting targeting commercial network platforms, self-media such as video platforms, social media, and live streaming industries. Through this special rectification purge in the past month, the Cyberspace Administration has blocked 5.59 million accounts, banned 338 live broadcast platforms, closed 74,000 live broadcast rooms, and blocked 105,000 live broadcast accounts. China analysts believe this move is meant to suppress influential voices online, and this is important because we can think of the timing of this. Now, as I've mentioned before on this show, the Chinese Communist Party is tightening its grip across the board. There is a large and ongoing pattern of incidents like this, and the trend is growing. Again, let's look at the trajectory. Look at the different incidents that have happened recently. The Chinese Communist Party is launching internal purges. It has new programs of religious suppression. It's using different programs to give incentives to average citizens to participate in its abuses of its own people. It's locking down Hong Kong, having new calls for taking over Taiwan. It's increasing its abusive measures in places like Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia. The Chinese Communist Party is taking all these different steps, and what is the trajectory? What do these patterns suggest? It suggests the Chinese Communist Party is strengthening its control over the country. The Chinese Communist Party is increasing its abuses of its own people. And at the same time, it's launching internal purges of Communist Party members to make sure they're in line with CCP doctrine. All of this suggests, based on this pattern and based on the trajectory, the Chinese Communist Party is afraid of something. And very likely what it's afraid of is threats to its own power. And now for the broader stories for today. First off, the Epoch Times has received leaked internal documents on the CCP's new measures for its crackdown on protesters in Inner Mongolia, where parents and students have been protesting a new CCP directive that requires some classes to be taught in Mandarin rather than in the traditional Mongolian language. This new document is entitled, quote, "The Daily Report on the Stability Maintenance of the Educational Reform in Xiangshan Township." That's in Inner Mongolia again. The report indicates that the CCP has established a special leading group to carry out education reform and to maintain stability, as they're calling it. It's led by the Communist Party committee secretary in that township. Now, it asks the local officials to establish a monitoring program at many different levels, including a grid surveillance system set up by the CCP that uses citizens on the grassroots level to monitor neighborhoods and also cover households. The report also orders teachers of each class to visit each person's home, quote, one-on-one, and requires school leaders to make similar visits to Mongolian-speaking households. The report also requires authorities to monitor groups on social media platform WeChat, including teacher-student chat groups, parent chat groups, and the local villagers, to closely, quote, monitor the trend of public opinion, and to, quote, firmly grasp the initiative of public opinion on education reform. It also gives orders to immediately report all of what they call abnormal situations as they're discovered to the committee and banner government. And so what's happening here? This is another case, we've seen several recently, of the Chinese Communist Party using normal citizens as tools to support its programs for social abuses. Now, we've seen other programs like this recently launched by the Chinese Communist Party. We reported previously, for example, that the CCP has launched a new program that gives cash rewards to people who report on other citizens for engaging in religious activities. For example, handing out flyers or printing Bibles. The Chinese Communist Party is using other people, using people in the grassroots, normal people in China, in order to act as arms of its abusive programs. And this says a few things. One is actually this does say something about the Chinese Communist Party's own ability to monitor people. It suggests, again, that a lot of its high-tech systems may not function as well as it claims they do. The Chinese Communist Party, at the very least, is having to bypass those systems in order to favor these local grassroots programs that use a low-tech approach. If its social credit system, if its cameras, if its different databases were working as planned, it would not need programs like this. Again, in China, many things do not function as the CCP claims they function. Many technologies are not as advanced as they claim they are. And this does signify, possibly, that some of the Chinese Communist Party's own claims on the advancement of its own technologies is not where it says it is. And so it's having to use programs like this, where it brings in people from the grassroots level to carry out the CCP's abuses on their behalf. Also, this ties into something bigger. Every home is being visited. Every home in this area is being visited. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to send a message to this, telling people in Inner Mongolia that if you oppose the Chinese Communist Party, we own you. They can go to your home, they can go into your home, and they can remind you of the policies and control of the Communist Party. But this also says something else. The Chinese Communist Party would not do this if they were not afraid. It would not be so aggressive, so on the surface, because doing so shows the true face of the regime. It shows them as a hostile system that is willing to persecute its own people, rather than, say, this friendly big brother veneer that they want to project. This shows the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And again, it also shows the fear of the CCP, because what is this really about? The Chinese Communist Party was going to make it so that classes in Inner Mongolia had to teach some classes in Mandarin, Chinese, rather than the local language. Some parents and some students protested. This is a low-level protest. It's not a big deal. You know, if this happened in most countries, this would be like nothing. The government, the top-level government, is getting involved in cracking down on these very basic protests. And so in other words, something that would be resolved very easily, saying, oh, the local teachers, local students, and local parents don't want classes being taught in a language foreign to their own. They see this as abusive. Rather than reforming that or trying to work with them, the CCP is taking a large-scale, hard-lined approach of visiting every single person's home, getting different citizens to go and monitor them, and to monitor their online social media activities and chats. This is a large-scale totalitarian action against what is really a very minor issue with protests. And in mainland China, the purge of CCP leaders is now underway. Close to 35 political and legal officials were arrested by authorities in February, as has now been discovered. The CCP is again launching a new internal purge that invokes Mao Zedong, the former chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. And this signifies that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to re-establish its authority. It wants to bring in line all the different Communist Party officials under the banner of communist ideology. Xi Jinping is walking the same line that Mao Zedong walked, again towards the title of chairman. And this program, the one that it's invoking, was the bloodiest purge in the history of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to, say, internal movements within the Communist Party itself. In other words, not necessarily against the Chinese people broadly, but within the confines of the CCP and its different members. And all of this should be viewed in context. We see right now the Chinese Communist Party implementing new social control systems for average citizens, seizing homes using Mao-era socialist narratives and property rights, cracking down on even minor dissent, and launching an internal CCP purge of its own members. It appears the Chinese Communist Party is moving forward with what we discussed previously on this show, something we said they were considering. You might remember what that was. Now, I said what we've been hearing from inside China through our own sources is that different officials, the hardliners within the Chinese Communist Party, were saying the threats to the Communist Party right now are things it cannot deal with using ordinary means. Unless the Chinese Communist Party were to, say, take the normal route, step back and reform. They're refusing to do that. And so what's the other course of action? They want to lock down the whole country. They want to restart their purges. They want to restart the different programs to reestablish the authority of the Chinese Communist Party. And they want to try to revitalize the communist system. We're seeing every single sign now that that is happening. And meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party has now begun using blockchain to power parts of its social credit system. Now, blockchain is one of the main systems at the heart of the Bitcoin electronic currency. It allows for a type of intranet that exists between devices. This is an open source system. This capability is now being rolled out by People's Daily, which is one of the CCP's main mouthpiece news outlets. As industry news outlet Decrypt reports, the People's Daily Online Public Opinion Monitoring Center, which is responsible for analyzing all online comments by Chinese netizens. And so again on this, one of the CCP's main mouthpiece news outlets, People's Daily, has a daily online monitoring program. It monitors public opinion. It's one of the main systems in charge of that. And it will be getting the new technology now known as Renmin Chain. It's developed by Hangzhou's Hyperchain technology. This will allow the Chinese Communist Party to extend its citizen databases across different provinces in China, so that people can't escape their citizen profiles under the social credit system if they try to travel to a different province. Everything will follow them. So what are we seeing here? This is open source technology, blockchain, being hijacked by a totalitarian system in order to be used for its social control systems. The Chinese Communist Party is using existing and open technology. Ironically, something that was meant to, say, liberate the idea of technology, to make people more able to have free thought online. Because, for example, you could form an intranet between devices. A lot of people who've been looking into blockchain technologies have been looking, for example, into, say, decentralized currency systems like Bitcoin, into, for example, a decentralized internet that can't be censored because it could exist between a network of phones, for example. The Chinese Communist Party is now using this, and they're using it to monitor their own citizens and to expand an already totalitarian system across all of China. And also, folks, to gain deeper insights into the power struggles within the Chinese Communist Party and the culture of thinking among its top leaders, I had the pleasure recently speaking with Kay Rubacek of Swoop Films about her new book, Who Are China's Walking Dead? The book features personal essays based on exclusive and rare interviews that she did with former CCP officials. Let's jump into that interview now. Hey, Kay, thank you for being on Crossroads.
Thanks for having me.
So this is an interesting title of a name for a book about Chinese Communist Party officials. Why don't you tell us about where this name came from?
There was a concept that they brought up when we were interviewing them actually for our new movie, and they used this term called the Walking Dead. And I kind of had to ask for the translator to just to do a double take on that and say, have you really got that correctly? Because I'm not understanding this. And it was correct. This is a term they used for themselves. And I started to find that there was a common thread that officials from different countries in different ranks of the officialdom, in different departments, of different ages, in different regions of the country, they all knew this term. And they used it sometimes differently, but they all used this term. So really the book became a documentation of my process to understand who are China's walking dead. And that's where the title came from.
Why would Chinese Communist Party officials refer to themselves and to each other as the walking dead?
It wasn't just themselves and each other, they did, but they also referred to other people in China, those who they referred to some people who still have hope in the CCP because they have no other choice, even though they know that in some ways they feel that they are up against a losing battle. They feel that some of them feel they're marching towards death. There was really a lot of hopelessness, and that I found that quite disturbing, actually. And so there's not one answer as to who are the walking dead, and that's why I really couldn't summarize it in one particular article, but I actually put together this series of essays to explore that, because it is themselves, it is others, it is the officialdom, it is the country in some ways. So this is quite a broad concept.
Now, when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, I know a lot of people would say, I hear it all the time, oh, China's no longer communist. They're engaging in capitalism. The Chinese Communist Party is changing and so on, or they don't have as much influence. Having interviewed the people who are at the top levels of the Communist Party and seeing how they view it, what did you see in terms of this? Are they still communist, and also how do they regard the communist system?
That was exactly one of the questions that I asked them all. And the different officials are at different levels in the Communist Party, but the officialdom is essentially they're the special ranks of the Chinese people. They are not regular, ordinary Chinese, as they would call themselves. They are privileged. They're the privileged class. And they are privileged because they are part of the CCP, for no other reason. The CCP still maintains its control. But I think one of the really connecting factors for the CCP changes. That's a fundamental thing. It does change. It continues to change. Not for the better. It maintains its underlying principles. But as one of the interviewees said to me, he says, change is a constant for the CCP culture. It is constantly changing, but that is to maintain its control. It's the only thing that can't change is that the CCP remains in control. Everything else can change according to the standards of the CCP. There is no rules for what cannot change. The economy can open up, the economy can close, people can live, people can die, but the CCP must maintain control. And that's one of the key points in the CCP constitution, in the constitution of the PRC, and something that all the officials have to follow. So that's really the only unchanging thing. Everything else can change, whether they call it communism, socialism, Marxism. Essentially, they could still call themselves a socialist state. That is, they are the rules, and they play by that. But what is said on the surface, or anything that, economy opening up and things like that, those things they don't really care about as long as the fundamentals don't change, and that's that the CCP remains in control.
You mentioned that one of the ways they have to rise in power is they're kind of required to step on others, to step on each other. Now, we hear a lot about these, infighting within the CCP. How does that relate when it comes to infighting versus them just stabbing each other in the backs to rise in power? How do these things relate to each other?
Well, You know, I think about all the mafia movies that I've watched, and if you're not in the right place at the right time and protected by the right person, you've got a bullet in the back of your head. It's really, there are not a lot of rules when it comes to how to get to the top. There are a lot of rules on the surface, and we interviewed someone who actually, an official who wrote many rules, books of rules and regulations for CCP members. But in the end, he said he wasn't able to use any of those rules to even protect himself, let alone other Chinese people. So it is who you know and who you are close with, and keeping them happy to make sure that they don't stab you in the back or use you as a scapegoat, because the CCP is never one to take the blame. And they will lay the blame on everyone else first. Foreign countries first will be the first in line to take the blame. The last in line are likely to be CCP officials, because that's getting a bit too close to home when you start to blame your own officials. They're supposed to be the elites. But when the officials do take the fall, there needs to be no evidence. Any evidence can be made at any point in time and faked, and they all know that. So there's a lot of stress. They're under constant stress and pressure to keep themselves alive, keep their family safe, to get their money out of China and make sure that their fortunes are not taken away from them. So really, there's just a whole lot of stress and pressure going on there. I don't think there's any one way that they move up in ranks other than getting protection and then possibly stepping on whoever got them up to the next level so that they don't push them down.
Now, with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also, if you want to support us, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, it really helps this channel grow. And also, please keep in mind that if you click the notification bell, a lot of people are saying they do not get notifications, so you do have to check manually. Also, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting us, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.